In this short video, we'll touch on some issues about sampling and survey research and how the ways we as researchers can avoid sampling biases in our studies. The book goes over a really nice example of surveys being used, for instance, in the 1936 presidential election. Polling was just ramping up to be able to predict the outcome of elections, in this case between Landon and Franklin Roosevelt. A magazine called the Literary Digest made a survey and sent it out to millions of Americans, asking them who they would vote for. The results from that survey led that magazine to predict that Landon would win in a landslide. At the same time that poll was going on, new pollsters in a different group were incorporating the scientific method in their survey construction. They were able to use a much smaller sample, and with that, they actually predicted the exact opposite, that Roosevelt would actually win in a landslide. Their prediction was ultimately correct, as we know, but the question here is, why would two different entities come to exactly opposite predictions? What could be causing those discrepancies? You would think that the company that surveyed more people would be more accurate. Well, let's actually dig into this a little deeper. Sampling bias occurs when a sample is selected in such a way that it is not representative of the entire population. Sometimes it can be hard to match a population exactly when you select a subset of people. You could be polling too heavily from one group or another. Bias was the reason the Literary Digest poll was so off in the 1936 presidential election. They overrepresented wealthier voters who just so happened to be more likely to vote for Landon. So even though they sampled way more people than the competitors' poll, this overrepresentation actually skewed their predictions in the wrong way. Apart from this, there's also non-response bias, and this is when you don't get responses from some people as they may have moved away, just didn't want to participate in the study, or for other reasons. This could also shift the sample or proportions of your sample away from what the actual population is. All research involves sampling, and to put a definition on that, it's selecting a sample of people to study from a bigger population of interest. The way we sample people can come from two different categories. The first is probability sampling, and this occurs when the researcher can specify the probability that each member of the population will be chosen for the sample. Non-probability sampling occurs when we cannot specify these probabilities. Most research involves non-probability sampling. Convenience sampling involves studying individuals who happen to be nearby and are also willing to participate. This is a very common form of non-probability sampling. The justification for using a convenience sampling approach is that you can still take that sample and experimentally manipulate a variable and run an actual experiment. However, there are some pitfalls to using this approach. You could have unbalanced proportions that aren't actually representative of the population. Research at universities rely on undergraduate psychology students. These students often fit under what is referred to as a weird population. And weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. This is a very specific subset of people, and a lot of times it's not really representative of the population for what you want to measure. When we talk about survey researchers more outside of academic fields, they are more likely to use a type of probability sampling. This is because in those cases, it's more important to get close, accurate estimates of what may be true in the population. And the best example for this is election outcomes. For that, you need probability samples. So first, you need to identify your population. Are they voters from Missouri or Florida, or maybe the entire United States, or even a totally different country? Once you identify what your population is, you then need a sampling frame. And this is just a list of all the members of the population that you can choose from. This can come from various sources, such as a list of registered voters, maybe hospital records, telephone dictionaries, or directories, university rosters, and a lot more. Okay, let's go over a few types of sampling. Simple random sampling. Here, each individual in the population has equal probability for being selected in your sample. Stratified random sampling is where the population is divided into subgroups or strata. This is mostly done based off of demographic statistics. Once you have each subgroup or stratum, you then take a random sample from each of those. This way you can begin to match on different dimensions of the population. Next is proportionate stratified random sampling. I know these names are kind of getting longer here, but this is where the proportion of respondents in each of the various subgroups matches the proportion of the population. So with this stratified random sampling, you get equal proportions of each subgroup, and with the proportionate stratified, you can get percentages that match the population. So maybe 10% from group A, and then 45% from group B, and so on. Disproportionate stratified random sampling is when groups are too small in percentages, so therefore they might, through random sampling, might not get selected. Or if they do get selected, there might be just too few of them to make any kind of valid conclusion. So therefore, researchers would disproportionately draw more samples from that subgroup in order to have enough people at all to make some type of conclusion. The next one is cluster sampling, and here larger clusters of individuals are randomly sampled, and then individuals within each cluster are then also randomly sampled. So say we want to get a sample of small town residents in Washington. First, the researcher would randomly pick several small towns. Here, those are the red circles, those are the picked ones, and the gray circles are the non-picked ones. Next, the researcher would go and randomly select a number of people within each one of those towns or red circles. This strategy could help with some limitations in research, such as excessive traveling for in-person surveys. So this helps by narrowing down the number of towns they have to go to while still being able to successfully randomly sample participants. Okay, last slide for this video. We should also touch on the thoughts about the sample size of your sample versus the population size. So how do we decide how many people we need? Why do we only sample a few hundred or 1,000 people when the actual population has millions and millions of people? It is true that larger samples will tend to get closer to the true population, and our estimates of how close our scores could be will get better. But this comes at a cost to the researchers in time and effort. Estimates do tend to plateau after a while. So let's say that 50% of a sample of registered voters will vote for candidate X. If there are 100 voters in this sample, then there's a 95% chance that the true percentage in the population will be included in the range between 40 and 60. If we have 1,000 voters in our sample now, then the 95% chance that the true percentage in this population is included is now in between 47 and 53, so that shrunk a lot. So we can say with more certainty that this is the case with more people. However, this confidence interval continues to shrink as sample size increases, but it does so at a slower and slower rate. So now if we double the sample again, so now to 2,000 people in the sample, this reduction is now only to 48 and 52. This small increase in confidence beyond this point isn't really worth the effort for most researchers. And importantly, this confidence estimate only depends on the sample that you pull, and it doesn't matter if the population size is 1 million or 100 million. So in this way, a smaller but proportionate sample can do the trick. Now in experimental research, the way we actually determine our sample size is different. So here it's actually based off of the size of the effect. So if we're studying something in which we know we will get a large effect, we don't really need to run as many subjects. If the effect size is smaller, that means it will be harder to detect and we'll need to collect a larger sample. We'll get more into this later on, but for now, we can say that for survey research, we sample as many people as we can until we're comfortable with our confidence interval estimates. And in experimental research, we recruit as many people as we need, which is dependent on the effect size of the topic we're studying.